Imagine the dusty road where it all began. A stretch of cracked asphalt cutting through the heart of Pearsall, Texas, where the heat rises in shimmering waves and the only sound is the wind whistling through the mesquite trees and the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel. That road tells the truth. It remembers the sweat, the breakdown trucks, the endless miles between honky-tonks, and the dreams that usually die before they reach the county line. But tonight, that honest Texas dust feels a million miles away. It has been replaced by the cold, unforgiving reflection of black glass and steel in the heart of Manhattan. The contrast was violent enough to make a man dizzy. Inside the Obsidian, New York City's most exclusive culinary temple, the air did not smell of rain or sagebrush. It smelled of truffle oil, expensive perfume, and the metallic scent of raw ambition. The lighting was dim, designed to flatter the surgically enhanced and the socially climbed, casting long, sharp shadows across the minimalist furniture that looked more like torture devices than places to rest a weary back. George Strait stood at the entrance, his boots, custom Lucchese, worn soft by years of use but polished to a mirror shine, making a distinct, solid sound against the imported Italian marble floor. It was a sound of substance in a room built on smoke and mirrors. Beside him stood Norma. After 50 years, she was still the only compass he ever needed. She wore a simple, elegant dress that whispered class rather than screaming for attention, a sharp contrast to the avant-garde. Structural pieces worn by the women sipping clear cocktails at the bar. George adjusted his black Stetson, a reflex born of decades under stage lights, but here the gesture felt defensive. He wasn't the king of country in this room. To the eyes staring at him over the rims of designer glasses, he was just an anomaly, an antique, a relic of a world they thought they had evolved past. They had come to the city to celebrate 50 years, half a century of waking up next to the same woman, of weathering storms that would have torn lesser loves apart, of raising a family and burying grief and finding joy in the quiet moments on the ranch. George wanted to give her the world tonight. He wanted anonymity, yes, but he also wanted excellence. He had been told the Obsidian was the best. Now standing under the judgmental gaze of the maitre d', he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct of a protective husband sensing disrespect before a word was even spoken. The maitre d', a young man with a haircut that cost more than George's first guitar and a suit cut so slim it looked painted on, scanned them from head to toe. His eyes lingered disdainfully on George's hat, then dropped to the boots. There was no recognition in his eyes. To this gatekeeper of cool, George Strait was not a living legend with 60 number-one hits. He was just an old cowboy who had wandered too far from the pasture. "Reservation for Strait," George said, his voice a low rumble that usually commanded the attention of stadiums. Here, it barely seemed to register over the thumping synthetic bass of the ambient house music. The young man tapped a finger on a tablet screen, sighing as if the interaction was physically draining him. He didn't look up. Strait. He muttered the name as if it were a typo. "Ah, yes, I see it here." He finally looked up, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile made of shark teeth and ice. "I am afraid, Mr. Strait, that we have a slight complication. The main dining room is at absolute capacity tonight. We have a very high-profile event occurring." George looked past the man's shoulder. The restaurant was busy, certainly, but he could see empty tables near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city skyline. He could see a prime booth in the center, currently unoccupied. "I booked this 2 months ago," George said, his tone remaining polite but firm. "It's our 50th anniversary." The maitre d' let out a small dismissive chuckle, as if George had told a joke that wasn't quite funny. How quaint. "Congratulations. However, in New York, reservations are fluid concepts. The table you requested has been allocated to a VIP guest who required immediate accommodation. I'm sure you understand. It's about the ecosystem of the room. The ecosystem." George felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. He looked at Norma. She was clutching her small clutch bag with both hands, her knuckles slightly white. She wasn't angry. She looked embarrassed. She hated causing a fuss. She hated being the reason for a scene. That look on her face broke George's heart more than the rudeness of the man in the suit ever could. "We can go somewhere else, George," Norma whispered, leaning in close. It doesn't matter. Let's just get a slice of pizza and go back to the hotel. I'd be just as happy. George looked at her, really looked at her. The way the soft light caught the silver in her hair, the lines around her eyes that he had watched deepen with laughter and worry over 5 decades. She deserved the pizza, sure, but she also deserved the best seat in the house. She deserved to be treated like the royalty she was. "No, Norma," George said softly, patting her hand. "We're staying, we're eating." He turned back to the host. "If the main room is full, where do you intend to put us?" The maitre d' gestured vaguely toward the back of the restaurant, near a pair of swinging metal doors. "We have a private niche available. It is very intimate." George knew what intimate meant in restaurant speak. It meant the table nobody else wanted. It meant the penalty box. But he nodded. "Fine. Lead the way." The walk through the dining room was a gauntlet. As they followed the host, George felt the eyes of the other patrons on them. It wasn't the adoration he was used to. It was curiosity, mixed with mockery. A group of young executives in suits that cost more than a pickup truck stopped their conversation to watch them pass. One of them, holding a martini glass, nudged his neighbor and pointed openly at George's hat. George heard the words drift through the air, sharp and stinging. "Look at that. Did the rodeo come to town early?" Laughter. Cruel, hollow laughter. George kept his eyes forward, his chin up. He placed a hand on the small of Norma's back, guiding her, shielding her. He was a majestic ship sailing through a sea of garbage. They passed the prime booth the host had claimed was taken. It was occupied now. A young man, barely 20 years old, sat there. He was wearing a neon yellow hoodie, a baseball cap worn backward, and oversized sneakers. He had his feet, his dirty, street-worn sneakers, propped up on the velvet seat opposite him. He was shouting into a phone while filming himself with a ring light set up on the table. This was the VIP. This was the ecosystem the maitre d' was protecting. George tightened his jaw but said nothing. They reached their table. It was tiny, wobbly, and shoved into a dark corner right next to the kitchen service entrance. Every time the double doors swung open, a blast of hot, noisy air and the shouting of chefs spilled out, along with the smell of dish soap and old grease. The view was of a fire extinguisher and a stack of high chairs. "Here we are," the maitre d' said, dropping 2 menus onto the table with a slap. "Your server will be with you, eventually. Enjoy." He spun on his heel and marched away before George could ask for a wine list. George pulled out the chair for Norma. She sat down, smoothing her dress, and looked up at him with a smile that was trying too hard to be brave. "It's cozy," she said. "It's a disgrace," George muttered, sitting opposite her. His knees bumped against the table leg, causing the silverware to rattle. "Norma, I'm sorry. This isn't what I planned." Norma reached across the small table and took his hand. Her skin was cool, her grip strong. "George Harvey Strait, look at me." He looked up, his blue eyes clouded with frustration. "Do you remember our first anniversary?" she asked. George let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "We were in that motel in Oklahoma, the one where the AC unit fell out of the window. And we ate vending machine crackers and drank lukewarm soda," Norma finished. "And it was perfect, because we were together. This is just noise, George. These people, this place, it's just scenery. You're here, I'm here, we made it to 50. Don't let a rude boy in a suit take that away from us." George felt the tension in his shoulders drop an inch. She always did that. She had a way of shrinking the chaos of the world until it was just the two of them in a quiet room. He turned his hand over and squeezed hers. "You're right. You're always right." But the world wasn't done with them yet. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No waiter appeared. Waiters rushed past them carrying silver platters of oysters and smoking cocktails to the other tables, avoiding eye contact with the elderly couple in the corner as if invisibility was contagious. George's patience, legendary for its length, was beginning to fray. He wasn't angry for himself. He was furious for her. Every minute they sat there ignored was an insult to the woman who had stood by him when they had nothing. At the table nearby, the group of executives was getting louder. They were drunk on expensive wine and their own sense of importance. One of them, a man with slicked back hair, turned his chair so he was facing George. "Hey, cowboy," he called out, his voice slurring slightly. "You lose your horse? Or are you just lost?" George slowly cut a piece of the bread that had finally been dropped off by a busboy. He didn't look up. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and took a sip of water. "I'm talking to you, Hopalong Cassidy," the man persisted, emboldened by the giggles of his companions. "You know, there's a dress code here. Usually it excludes barn animals." Norma flinched. That was it. George set his knife down. The metal clinked against the china like a gavel striking a judge's bench. He turned his head slowly, fixing the man with a stare that had stopped bar fights without a punch being thrown. It was the stare of a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to shout to prove it. "Enjoy your dinner, son," George said. His voice was quiet, level, and terrifyingly calm. "Before you say something you can't take back." The executive blinked, momentarily stunned by the gravity in the old man's voice. For a second, the predator instinct in him recognized a bigger, more dangerous animal. He turned back to his friends, muttering something about senile old bats. But he didn't speak to George again. However, the atmosphere in the room was shifting. It started as a subtle ripple, a change in the frequency of the noise. It wasn't coming from the kitchen or the drunk executives. It was coming from the digital ether. At the center booth, the VIP kid in the neon hoodie, the influencer, had stopped shouting at his phone. He was staring at his screen, his mouth slightly open. He swiped, tapped, and swiped again. Then he looked up, scanning the room frantically. His eyes landed on the dark corner near the kitchen. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom. Then a sound, a ping. Then another. Ping, ping, chirp. It was the sound of notifications. It started at the VIP table, then spread to the table of executives, then to a couple by the window. It was a cascade of digital alerts, a domino effect of connectivity. The blue glow of screens began to illuminate the dim restaurant, like fireflies waking up in a cavern. George didn't notice at first. He was too busy trying to flag down a waiter to get Norma a glass of wine. But Norma noticed. She saw the influencer stand up. She saw him whisper something to the girl next to him, pointing directly at their table. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are they staring?" George looked around. It was true. The ambient chatter of the restaurant had died down, replaced by a low, buzzing murmur. People were holding their phones up, looking at a screen, then looking at Norma, then looking back at the screen. It was an eerie, synchronized movement. It felt like being in a zoo where the animals had suddenly decided to study the visitors. The maitre d' noticed the disturbance. He hurried over to the VIP table, looking concerned. "Is everything all right, sir? Is the lighting to your liking?" The influencer ignored him. He stood up, pushing the table aside. He wasn't looking at the host. He was looking at Norma straight with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was something else. Awe, disbelief. George felt a surge of adrenaline. He didn't know what was happening, but his instinct told him his wife was being targeted. He pushed his chair back and stood up to his full height. He adjusted his jacket, squaring his shoulders. If this was going to be a confrontation, he would meet it standing up. "What is going on?" George demanded, his voice finally rising above the murmur. The maitre d', sensing a loss of control, rushed toward George. "Sir, please sit down. You are disturbing the other guests. I've already warned you about the hat. If you continue to cause a scene, I will have to ask you to leave." George ignored the little man. He looked at the sea of faces, the wall of smartphones pointed at them. He stepped in front of Norma, blocking their view with his body. I said, "What is going on? Why are you pointing those things at my wife?" The room went silent, dead silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed to fade. The influencer in the neon hoodie took a step forward. He walked past the maitre d', past the executives, walking slowly, reverently, toward the corner table. He held his phone out like an offering. "You don't know?" the kid asked, his voice cracking. "You haven't seen it?" "Seen what?" George snapped. The kid turned the phone around. The screen was bright, blinding in the dim corner. "Sir, Mr. Straight, nobody is looking at you." "They're looking at her." He nodded toward Norma, who was peeking out from behind George's arm. "Twitter, TikTok, the news. It's everywhere," the kid continued, breathless. "It dropped 10 minutes ago. An archivist in Nashville found it. A lost reel, 1971. George frowned. 1971, that was a lifetime ago. That was before the hits, before the stadiums. That was when they were broke, hungry, and running on hope. The kid pressed play. On the small screen, a grainy black-and-white image flickered to life. There was no sound at first, just the scratchy hiss of old film. The camera angle was low, handheld, shaky. It showed the interior of a dusty, cluttered pawn shop. Guitars hung from the ceiling like cured hams. Glass cases were filled with watches and wedding bands, the debris of broken dreams. And there, standing at the counter, was a girl. She was young, so incredibly young. Her hair was long and dark, pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was wearing a coat that looked too thin for the weather. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach. She was pregnant. George felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that coat, he knew that ponytail, he knew that girl. It was Norma. But he had never seen this footage. He had never been in that pawn shop. In the video, the pawn shop owner, a large man with a cigar clamped between his teeth, leaned over the counter. The audio crackled in. "You sure about this, darling? Once I write the ticket, it's gone. Unless you come back with the cash plus interest in 30 days. And looking at you, I don't think you're coming back. I don't." The young Norma in the video looked down at the counter. Her fingers were trembling, but her chin was high, the same defiant, quiet dignity she had shown the maitre d' just moments ago. "I'm sure," she said. Her voice on the recording was sweet, clear, and heartbreakingly young. She pushed something across the glass counter. The camera zoomed in clumsily. It was a ring, an antique diamond ring, with a setting that looked like a flower. George gasped. He felt Norma's hand tighten on his arm behind him. He froze. That was her grandmother's ring, the one she said she had lost in a move, the one she had cried over for weeks. The pawnbroker picked it up, examining it with a loupe. "It's a nice piece." "Family heirloom." "Yes," young Norma whispered. "It was my grandmother's. She brought it from Mexico." "Why are you selling it?" the man asked, opening the cash register. "Husband drinking it away?" "No," Norma said sharply. The fire in her eyes burned even through the grainy footage. "He doesn't drink. He sings." The pawnbroker laughed. "Everybody sings in Texas, honey. What makes him special?" Norma leaned in. The camera caught the absolute, unshakable conviction in her eyes. "Because he has a voice that God gave him, but the world is charging him rent for it. He needs studio time. He needs to record his demo. If he doesn't do it now, he'll give up. He'll go work at the plant and he'll never sing again. And the world will lose something beautiful." She took the stack of bills the man offered. She counted them carefully. "Don't tell him," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If he asks, I lost it. He's too proud. He wouldn't take the money if he knew. Just give me the receipt." The video ended with her walking out of the shop, wiping a single tear from her cheek, before composing herself and putting on a bright fake smile as she stepped out the door to greet someone waiting outside. The video looped. George stood there in the obsidian, the phone screen blurring before his eyes. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, suffocating, but it wasn't hostile anymore. It was the silence of a church. He slowly turned to look at his wife, the woman who had just offered to eat pizza to save him from embarrassment. The woman who had sat in the cheap seats for 50 years so he could stand in the spotlight. "Norma," George whispered, his voice broken. "You told me you lost it down the sink drain." Norma looked down at her hands, the hands that were now wrinkled and spotted with age. She shrugged, a small, shy motion. "You got the studio time, George. You cut unwound. And the rest? Well, the rest is history." George felt his knees go weak. He sat down heavily in his chair. He looked at the maitre d' who was standing there with his mouth open, pale as a sheet. He looked at the influencer who was openly weeping, tears streaming down his face onto his neon hoodie. The world had just watched a secret kept for half a century. They thought they were looking at a country star's wife. They just realized they were looking at the architect of the legend. But the night wasn't over. The video had unlocked something. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from judgment to a desperate need for redemption. The maitre d' took a step forward, his hands shaking. "Mr. Straight, Mrs. Straight, I had no idea. George didn't look at him. He was looking at Norma, seeing her for the first time again. But the crowd was moving. They were no longer customers. They were witnesses. The silence in the obsidian was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on the crystal glasses and the imported linens. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to roar like a jet engine in the vacuum left by the video. George Strait sat frozen, his hand still covering Norma's on the white tablecloth. The image of his wife, 50 years younger, pregnant, terrified, yet fiercely determined, was burned into his retinas. He blinked, and for a moment, the sterile luxury of the New York restaurant dissolved. He wasn't seeing the polished silverware or the abstract art on the walls. He was seeing the peeling paint of their first apartment in San Marcos. He was smelling the stale beer of the honky-tonks where he played for tips, thinking he was the one carrying the weight of their future. He had walked around for 5 decades calling himself a self-made man. The phrase now tasted like ash in his mouth. "Norma," George said again, his voice barely a rasp. He looked at her hand. The ring finger now wore a beautiful diamond, one he had bought her for their 25th anniversary. It was big, flawless, expensive. But it wasn't the ring. It wasn't the grandmother's heirloom with the flower setting. I looked for that ring for years. I tore the house apart. I blamed the movers. I blamed myself. Norma gently pulled her hand away, not to withdraw but to reach up and touch his cheek. Her thumb brushed against the rough stubble of his jaw. "George, honey, listen to me. A ring is just metal and stone. It's cold. What we built, that's warm. That's alive. If I had kept that ring, we might be sitting in a nice house in Pearsall right now, watching someone else sing your songs on TV. I made a trade, and I'd make it again 1,000 times. But you sacrificed your history," George argued, his eyes glistening. The cowboy rides away stoicism was cracking, revealing the raw, beating heart beneath. "You sold your family's legacy so I could chase a gamble." "You weren't a gamble, George," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that defied her age. "You were a sure thing. I just needed the rest of the world to catch up to what I already knew." A sob broke the intimacy of their moment. It came from the influencer, the kid in the neon hoodie named Jax. He was still standing by their table, holding the phone like a holy relic. He wiped his nose with the sleeve of his expensive streetwear. I spent $10,000 on a watch last week," Jax blurted out, his voice thick with emotion. "Just to show it off on Instagram, just for likes." He looked at Norma with a mixture of shame and reverence. "You gave up everything for something nobody could even see yet." Jax turned to the room, his voice gaining strength. "Did you hear that?" he shouted at the executives, at the models, at the people who had been sneering minutes ago. "She sold her grandmother's ring so we could have Amarillo by morning. She sold her past so we could have the music." The drunk executive, the one who had called George Hopalong Cassidy, looked down at his half-eaten steak. The arrogance had drained out of him, leaving him looking small and puffy. He signaled the waiter for the check, his hand trembling slightly. He couldn't look in George's direction. The shame was palpable, a contagion spreading from table to table. But the maitre d' was in a state of panic. He was watching the room turn. He saw the phones still recording. He realized with a cold dread that his restaurant, his kingdom of exclusivity, was currently being broadcast to millions as the villain in a real-life fairy tale. The narrative was writing itself in real time. The obsidian treats the queen of country like trash. He had to fix this, immediately. He snapped his fingers at a busboy, his face a mask of desperate hospitality. "Champagne, the vintage Dom Perignon, now, and bring the caviar service, the reserved tin." He rushed to the small, dark table near the kitchen doors, practically sliding on the marble floor. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "Mr. Strait, Mrs. Strait," the maitre d' stammered, wringing his hands. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding, a glitch in our reservation system, truly regrettable. Please allow us to move you. The VIP booth is available. The young gentleman has offered to vacate it. We want to treat you to the full experience, on the house, of course. Everything is on the house." George slowly turned his head away from Norma to look at the man. The transformation in George's eyes was terrifying. The sadness was gone, replaced by the cold, hard steel of a Texas winter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He just looked at the man with the kind of disappointment a father looks at a son who has lost his way. "You want to move us now?" George asked quietly. "Yes, yes, immediately!" The maitre d' nodded vigorously, sweating. "To the window, the best view in Manhattan." George picked up his fork. He speared a small potato from his plate. "Son, you seem confused about how respect works. You think it's something you can serve on a platter after you realize who someone is." "Sir, Respect," George interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, "is how you treat the person who has nothing to offer you. It's how you treat the folks in the cheap seats. It's how you treat a woman sitting in the dark." George gestured to the cramped, shadowy corner they were sitting in. "You put us here because you thought we didn't matter. You thought we were just dust on your shiny floor. Now that you see the cameras, now that you see the internet cares, suddenly we're VIPs. George took a bite of the potato, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "No, thank you. We'll stay right here. This table suits us fine. It reminds me of where we started. And frankly, the company back here near the kitchen." He nodded at a line cook who was peeking through the window of the swinging doors, wearing a dirty apron and looking at George with wide, admiring eyes. "Is a hell of a lot more authentic than what's out there." The maitre d' stood there, gutted. He had been dismissed. Not with a yell, but with a moral judgment that no amount of free champagne could wash away. He retreated into the shadows, defeated. Meanwhile, the phenomenon was growing. Jax, the influencer, was reading comments aloud from his phone, unable to stop himself. Someone in Ohio says, "My dad died of cancer last year. George's music was the only thing that calmed him down. Norma bought my dad peace." Jack scrolled. A soldier in Afghanistan says, "I listened to Carrying Your Love with me on every patrol. It kept me alive. Thank you, Norma." A woman in Tennessee says, "I pawned my wedding ring to feed my kids in '85. I felt so ashamed until right now. Norma made me feel like a hero." Norma buried her face in her hands. She wasn't used to this. She was the woman in the background. She was the one who made the sandwiches, who ironed the shirts, who stayed home when the tour bus rolled out. To be the center of this global wave of gratitude was overwhelming. George saw her trembling. He knew she needed an anchor. He stood up. The sound of his chair scraping back was the only sound in the room. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to watch through the porthole windows. George, straight, 6 feet of country dignity, adjusted his jacket. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked only at his wife. He reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a wallet or a phone. He pulled out a guitar pick. It was a simple plastic pick he always carried, a habit, a talisman. He tapped it on the empty wine glass in front of him. Ting, ting, ting. "I don't have my band here," George said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room without a microphone. "And I don't have my guitar, but I have something more important." He held out his hand to Norma. "Dance with me, Norma." Norma looked up, teary-eyed. "Here? George, there's no music, and we're next to the mop bucket." "There's always music," George smiled. "And I don't care about the bucket, I care about the girl." She stood up. The room held its breath. George pulled her close. His right hand went to her waist, his left hand clasped hers. He began to sway, a slow 2-step rhythm that was ingrained in his DNA. And then he began to sing, a cappella. His voice was older now, deeper, seasoned like oak, but it was pure. "Baby, I've been creating a lie, pretending that I'm the man in charge." He wasn't singing one of his radio hits. He was improvising, or perhaps recalling a song he had written in his head 1,000 times but never recorded. "I stood in the lights, took the bow, took the gold, while you sold the diamonds to save my soul. They call me the king, but they don't understand that the crown was bought by the ring on your hand." The lyrics hung in the air, simple and devastating. As they danced in that cramped corner, turning slowly between the kitchen door and the stack of high chairs, the atmosphere in the obsidian shattered completely. It wasn't a restaurant anymore. It was a confessional. The executives were crying. The models were crying. The line cook behind the door was wiping his eyes with his apron. Jax, the influencer, lowered his phone. He felt like he shouldn't be recording this. This was too holy. This was a man apologizing to his wife after 50 years of not knowing the true cost of his own life. George spun her gently. "I'm going to get it back, Norma," he whispered in her ear, low enough that only she could hear, but the room felt the intensity of the vow. "I don't care if I have to track down every pawn shop in Texas. I don't care if it's been melted down, I will find it, or I will spend the rest of my life trying." Norma rested her head on his chest, listening to the heartbeat she had protected for half a century. "You don't have to, George. You really don't." "I do," he said, stopping the dance but not letting go. "Because tonight I realized something. I ain't the king of country, Norma. I'm just the husband of the queen." The moment was perfect, fragile, beautiful. And then, the kitchen doors swung open with a bang. A young chef, covered in flour and sweat, stumbled out. He wasn't looking at the celebrities. He was looking at George. He held a smartphone in his shaking hand. "Mr. Straight," the chef yelled, forgetting all protocol. "Mr. Straight, you have to look at this. The internet, they found him." George frowned, shielding Norma. "Found who, son?" "The pawn shop owner," the chef gasped, holding the screen up. "The guy from the video, or his son. He's on a live stream right now from San Antonio. He says he still has the ticket. He says he never sold the ring." The air left the room. George stared at the chef. "What did you say?" "He kept it," the chef said, scrolling frantically. "He says his dad knew. His dad knew you were going to be somebody. He kept the ring in a safe for 50 years, waiting for you to come back for it. He says it's waiting for you, George." Norma's hand flew to her mouth. A gasp, loud and sharp, escaped her lips. George looked at the chef, then at Jax, then at Norma. The impossible had just become possible. The road from that dusty pawn shop in 1971 to this high-rise in Manhattan had just connected in a perfect, divine circle. George grabbed his hat from the table and jammed it onto his head. The sorrow was gone. The regret was gone. Now, there was only a mission. "Check, please," George said to the empty air. But he didn't wait for it. He took Norma's hand with a grip of iron. "Let's go, Norma. We have a flight to catch." "George," Norma stammered, "we can't just leave. The dinner." "To hell with the dinner," George grinned, a flash of the young cowboy coming back to his face. "We're going to Texas. We're going to get your ring back." As they turned to leave, the restaurant didn't just watch. They moved. The sea of tables parted. People stood up, not to take photos, but to stand at attention. It was a guard of honor formed by bankers, models, and tourists. But as George and Norma reached the exit, the maitre d' stepped in front of them one last time. He looked terrified, but he held up a hand. "Mr. Straight, please." George stopped. He looked down at the man. "Get out of my way, son." "No, sir, I mean..." The maitre d' swallowed hard, tears in his eyes. "My father, he loved your music. He passed away without a penny. But he left me his records. I am so sorry." He wasn't asking for forgiveness for the restaurant. He was asking for forgiveness for his soul. George looked at him, really looked at him, and because he was George Straight, and because this was a story about redemption, he nodded. "Don't apologize to me," George said, tipping the brim of his hat. "Apologize to the next couple who walks in here wearing boots. You never know who you're talking to." He pushed past the man and out into the cool New York night. The door closed behind them, leaving the obsidian in silence once more. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a room that had just been visited by angels and realized too late that it hadn't offered them a seat. Outside on the sidewalk, the city lights were bright, but they looked different to George now. They didn't look cold. They looked like stars. "Taxi!" George whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. A yellow cab screeched to a halt. "Where to, Mac?" the driver asked, chewing gum. George opened the door for Norma, helping her in like she was made of porcelain and steel. He looked back at the driver, his blue eyes blazing. "Teterboro Airport," George said, "and drive fast. I have a date with a pawn shop in San Antonio." The flight from Teterboro to San Antonio was the longest 4 hours of George Straight's life. He had spent 50 years on tour buses and private jets, crossing time zones as easily as most men cross the street. But this journey felt different. It was a pilgrimage. The cabin of the Gulf Stream was quiet, pressurized silence humming against the ears. Norma had fallen asleep an hour ago, her head resting on a pillow against the window. The lights of the American Midwest drifting by 30,000 feet below like scattered embers. George couldn't sleep. He sat across from her, watching the rise and fall of her chest, nursing a glass of iced tea that had long since gone watery. He kept thinking about the weight of things. A guitar weighs about 8 pounds, a gold record weighs maybe 3. A tour bus weighs 20 tons. But a secret? A secret kept for half a century out of pure, selfless love. That was heavier than all of it combined. He looked at his own hands, hands that had roped steers, strummed chords, and signed million-dollar contracts. They felt empty. They felt unworthy. He realized that while he had been the face of the brand, the voice on the radio and the cowboy in the spotlight, Norma had been the foundation. You can build a castle on sand, and it might look pretty for a day, but Norma had built their castle on bedrock, and she had used her own history as the mortar. When the wheels touched down in San Antonio, the sun was just beginning to bleed purple and orange over the horizon. It was a Texas sunrise, violent, beautiful, and unapologetic. The air that hit them when the cabin door opened wasn't the sterile, recycled air of New York. It was thick. It smelled of humidity, diesel, and damp earth. It smelled like home. George didn't wait for a driver. He had his truck brought around to the tarmac. A white Chevy Silverado, dusty from the ranch roads. He threw their bags in the bed himself. He needed to feel the work. He needed to drive. Norma climbed into the passenger seat, looking tired but awake, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape with a mixture of nervousness and relief. "You know where it is?" she asked softly as they merged onto the highway, the city of San Antonio waking up around them. "I know," George said, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "I looked it up while you were sleeping. It's on the west side, Old Zarzamora Street." They drove in silence. The city gave way to older neighborhoods, places where the paint was peeling and the fences were chain link, but the porches were swept clean. This was the San Antonio of their youth, the San Antonio of struggle and ambition. They pulled up to a low brick building with bars on the windows and a faded sign that read, "Miller's Pawn and Loan, Easter 1955. It was closed. The metal grate was pulled down tight. George parked the truck. He turned off the engine. The silence returned, accompanied by the ticking of the cooling metal. He looked at his watch. 7 a.m. "They don't open until 9, George," Norma said. "I know," he replied. He opened his door. "But I'm not waiting." He walked up to the metal grate. He didn't bang on it, he didn't shout. He just stood there, adjusting his hat, waiting. A minute passed, then 5. Then the sound of a heavy lock tumbling echoed from inside. The metal grate groaned and began to rise slowly, revealing a dusty glass door. Standing on the other side was a man. He was in his 60s, balding, wearing a grease-stained polo shirt and reading glasses on a chain. He looked tired. He unlocked the glass door and pushed it open, the bell above it jingling with a cheerful sound that seemed out of place in the heavy morning air. "I saw the truck," the man said. His voice was raspy, like he'd smoked a pack a day for 40 years. He looked at George, then at Norma standing by the truck. He didn't ask for an autograph. He didn't pull out a phone. He just nodded. "You made good time from New York." "You're the son?" George asked, extending his hand. "I'm Travis," the man said, taking George's hand. His grip was firm, calloused. "My dad was Old Man Miller. He passed 10 years ago." "Travis," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "The internet said—" "Come in," Travis interrupted gently. "It's better we do this off the street. Folks are starting to wake up." The inside of the shop was a time capsule. It smelled of old paper, gun oil, and lemon polish. Rows of acoustic guitars hung on the wall like silent spectators. Glass cases held rows of watches, power tools, and jewelry. It was a museum of temporary desperation, a place where people traded their pasts to buy a future. George felt a lump in his throat. He had been in places like this 1,000 times in the early days. He remembered the shame of it. But looking at Norma, he realized there was no shame here, only sacrifice. Travis walked behind the counter. He didn't go to the register. He walked to the back, to a large, formidable steel safe that looked like it had survived a war. He spun the dial, left, right, left. The tumblers clicked, a sound loud in the quiet shop. He pulled the heavy handle, and the door swung open with a sigh of air that had been trapped for decades. He reached into the dark recess of the safe and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. It was dusty. He blew the dust off, a small cloud dancing in the shaft of morning sunlight coming through the window. Travis walked back to the counter and placed the envelope on the scratched glass. "My dad," Travis started, looking down at the envelope. He was a hard man. He didn't give charity. Business was business. But he had an ear. He used to listen to the radio all day. Travis looked up at George. "When that girl came in, when your wife came in back in '71, Dad told me about it that night at dinner. I was just a kid. He said, 'Travis, a girl came in today. She had the eyes of a believer, and she sold me a ring to bet on a horse named George Strait.'" Norma walked up to the counter, standing beside George. She was trembling. "He never put it in the case," Travis continued. "He put it in the safe. He marked the ticket, 'Do not sell.' Every time you had a hit song, every time you won an award, Dad would go into the safe, look at the ring and smile. He'd say, 'I own a piece of that. I helped buy the gas for that ride.'" Travis opened the envelope. He tipped it over. Out slid a ring. It wasn't a massive rock. It was modest. A gold band, slightly worn, with a central diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a floral pattern. It was a ring from a different era, an era before stylists and sponsorships. It was a ring that belonged on the hand of a woman who made tortillas from scratch and mended her husband's shirts. George stared at it. He felt tears pricking his eyes hot and fast. He remembered it now. He remembered seeing it on her finger when they were teenagers, driving his first truck, talking about dreams that seemed impossible. "He kept the ticket too," Travis said, sliding a piece of pink carbon paper across the glass. George picked up the ticket. The handwriting was scrawled and faded, but legible. Item, gold diamond ring. Loan amount, 150 Zerallas. Customer, Norma Strait. $150. That was the price. That was the seed money for a career that had generated millions, that had touched millions of lives. $150. George reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his checkbook. "Travis, I want to pay you. I want to pay you the interest. 50 years of interest. Name your price. I'll write it right now. 10,000? 50,000? You name it." Travis shook his head slowly. He pushed the checkbook back toward George. "Put that away, Mr. Strait?" "No," George insisted. "Your father kept this. He protected it. I owe you." "You don't owe me a dime," Travis said, his voice cracking slightly. "My dad died listening to Troubadour. He was in the hospital in pain, and your voice was the only thing that gave him peace. You paid him back every time you sang a note. This ring, it was just collateral. The loan is paid in full." George stood there, the checkbook hanging uselessly in his hand. He realized then that some debts cannot be paid with money. They can only be acknowledged with grace. He nodded, unable to speak. He turned to Norma. She was crying silently, her hands covering her mouth. George picked up the ring. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat of her hand from 50 years ago. He took her left hand. He looked at the massive, flawless diamond solitaire she was wearing, the anniversary gift, the symbol of his success. "Give me this," George whispered. Norma slid the expensive ring off. George placed it on the counter. It looked cold and sterile next to the yellowed envelope. Then, with hands that shook slightly, hands that had held the reins of bucking horses and the necks of priceless guitars, George Strait slid the old ring back onto Norma's finger. It fit perfectly. It slid over the knuckle and settled at the base of her finger, as if it had never left, as if it had just been waiting for the long circle to close. George brought her hand to his lips and kissed the ring. Then he kissed her fingers. Then he looked into her eyes. "I promise you," George said, his voice rough and raw, echoing in the quiet shop, "I will never make you sell anything again, and I promise you, for the rest of my life, I will try to be the man you saw when you walked into this shop in 1971. Norma laughed through her tears, a sound like rain in a drought. "You already are, George. You always were. I just bought you some time." They stood there for a long moment, embracing in the dusty light of the pawn shop, while Travis watched, wiping his own eyes with a rag. The king and queen of country, reunited not by a crown, but by a pawn ticket. "Thank you, Travis," George said, turning back to the man. He reached out and shook his hand again. "If you ever need anything at all." "Just keep singing, George," Travis smiled. "That's all the payment we need." George tipped his hat. He took Norma's arm and they walked out of the shop. The morning had fully broken now. The sun was bright and harsh, illuminating the grit of the street. A few cars were slowing down as they passed the white truck, drivers doing double takes. The world was waking up. The media vans would be here soon, the chaos would return. But for now, it was just them. They climbed back into the truck. George started the engine. The rumble of the V8 was comforting. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb, heading toward the highway that would take them south, toward the ranch, toward the brush country, toward home. George drove with one hand on the wheel. His other hand rested on the center console, holding Norma's. He ran his thumb over the rough setting of the flower ring. "You hungry?" George asked after a few miles. "Starving," Norma said, wiping her face with a tissue. "We never got that dinner in New York." George smiled, a genuine crinkled-eye smile that took 10 years off his face. "I know a place in Cotula. Best breakfast tacos in the world. Plastic chairs, sticky tables. No reservations required." "Sounds perfect," Norma said, leaning back in the seat and closing her eyes. "And Norma?" "Yes, George. Her, you can leave the hat on," he chuckled. "I don't think anyone there is going to complain about the aesthetic." As the truck sped down Interstate 35, leaving the city behind and entering the vast open embrace of the Texas plains, George Strait reached over and turned on the radio. He didn't look for a station playing his songs. He found a static-filled AM station playing old, traditional Tejano music. The accordions wheezed, the guitars strummed, and the rhythm filled the cab. It wasn't a song about fame, it wasn't a song about money. It was a song about love, about the land, and about the long, dusty road that leads you back to where you belong. George tapped the steering wheel in time with the beat. He looked at the road ahead. It was straight. It was clear. And for the first time in 50 years, he felt like he had finally paid his dues. The debt was settled, the ring was home, and the cowboy, finally, was just a man driving his wife to breakfast.